Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in Nevada territory. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The summer of 1850 in Nevada territory was unforgiving, even by frontier standards. The sun beat down mercilessly on the makeshift settlements that had sprouted like weeds along the Carson River, each one birthed from dreams of gold and sustained by desperation. Among these rough-hewn communities, nestled in a valley between two barren hills about 15 miles northwest of what would later become Carson City, stood a peculiar establishment that would become the subject of whispered tales for generations to come. The Gilded Serpent Saloon was not remarkable for its size or grandeur. Built from hastily assembled pine boards and roofed with whatever materials could be salvaged or stolen, it looked much like every other drinking establishment that had mushroomed across the territory. What made it unusual was its proprietress, Cordelia Ashmore, a 34-year-old widow who had inherited the business from her late husband, Zachariah Kestrel, after his death in a mining accident that spring. Cordelia was not what most would expect of a frontier woman running a saloon. Educated in Philadelphia before moving west with Zachariah in 1849, she possessed a refined manner of speech and carried herself with a dignity that seemed out of place among the rough miners and drifters who frequented her establishment. She wore her auburn hair in a tight bun, kept her dark dresses modest and clean, and conducted business with a cool efficiency that both impressed and unsettled her patrons. The territorial records from that period, preserved in the Nevada State Archives, show that the Gilded Serpent was officially registered as a business on May 3, 1850, just 2 weeks after Zachariah's death. The speed with which Cordelia took control of the operation struck some as unseemly, though frontier life rarely allowed for extended periods of mourning. What the records don't mention, but local accounts from the time suggest, is that several of the regular customers noticed immediate changes in the establishment once Cordelia took charge. Barnabas Wexford, a prospector from Ohio who kept a detailed diary of his time in Nevada, wrote on May 20, 1850, "The widow Ashmore has transformed that den of vice into something approaching respectability, though there remains an air about the place that I cannot adequately describe. The miners still drink and gamble as before, but conversations seem more hushed, and men glance frequently toward the corners of the room as though expecting to find someone watching them. Perhaps it is merely the presence of a woman of quality that has sobered their behavior, yet I confess to feeling an inexplicable unease during my visits there." The location of the Gilded Serpent itself was the source of some local controversy. Zachariah had purchased the land from a Paiute chief named Standing Bear in a transaction that many considered questionable at best. According to Territorial Land Office records, the deed was signed with an X mark and witnessed by only Zachariah himself and a man named Silas Drummond, whose identity and relationship to either party remains unclear. Standing Bear, when questioned years later by a traveling missionary, claimed through an interpreter that the land was sacred burial ground and should never have been built upon, though whether he understood the terms of the sale at the time of signing remains a matter of speculation. What gives credence to Standing Bear's claim is the construction process itself. When Zachariah began digging the foundation for his saloon in late 1849, workers repeatedly uncovered what appeared to be human remains. Rather than cease construction or relocate, Zachariah ordered the bones to be collected and reburied in a hastily dug pit behind the building. This decision, while not uncommon in a territory where death was a daily reality and sentiment was considered a luxury, would later take on more sinister implications. The first disappearance occurred on June 14, 1850, barely 6 weeks after Cordelia had assumed control of the saloon, Tobias Grimm, a German immigrant who had been working a small claim about 3 miles from the settlement, failed to appear for his regular evening drink. This in itself was not unusual. Men disappeared constantly on the frontier, victims of claim jumpers, wild animals, accidents, or simply the decision to try their luck elsewhere. What made Tobias's absence noteworthy was the discovery of his horse 2 days later, still saddled and tied to the post outside the Gilded Serpent, where it had apparently been standing since the night he vanished. Cordelia, when questioned by several of Tobias's acquaintances, maintained that she had not seen him that evening. She claimed to have been busy with inventory in the back room and had left the bar in the care of her employee, a taciturn man named Cornelius Vale, who had appeared in the settlement shortly after Zachariah's death. Vale corroborated her story, stating that Tobias had indeed entered the saloon but had left after a single drink, appearing agitated and mumbling about voices in the walls. The territorial sheriff, Hamilton Brooke, conducted a perfunctory investigation that consisted mainly of questioning the handful of men who had been present in the saloon that night. Their accounts were largely consistent. Tobias had seemed nervous and distracted, had consumed his whiskey quickly, and had left without speaking to anyone. One patron, a blacksmith named Virgil Thorne, mentioned that Tobias had spent several minutes staring at the floorboards near the back wall of the establishment, though he could not explain why this detail had stuck in his memory. Sheriff Brooks' report, filed on June 20th, 1850, concluded that Tobias Grimm had likely fallen victim to claim jumpers or had decided to abandon his prospects and move on to California. The case was closed, and life in the settlement continued much as before. However, several residents noted that the atmosphere in the Gilded Serpent had begun to change in subtle but unmistakable ways. Prospector Barnabas Wexford made another entry in his diary on July 2nd. Visited the Serpent again tonight, though I confess I derive less pleasure from these sojourns than I once did. The establishment maintains its outward appearance of normalcy, yet there is something in the air that disturbs the spirit. Conversations die away when one approaches certain areas of the room, particularly near the back wall where young Tobias was last seen studying the floor. Even the widow herself seems changed. Where once she moved about her establishment with confident authority, she now appears to listen constantly to sounds that others cannot hear. On 2 occasions tonight I observed her pause in her work and turn her attentions to the walls, as though responding to some unheard summons. When I inquired about her health, she assured me that all was well, but her smile did not reach her eyes. The second disappearance occurred on July 23rd, exactly 5 weeks after Tobias Grimm had vanished. This time the victim was Leopold Vance, a soft-spoken clerk from Boston who had come west to seek his fortune, but had found work keeping books for several of the more successful mining operations. Leopold was known for his methodical habits and punctual nature, which made his sudden absence all the more conspicuous. Unlike Tobias, who had been seen entering the Gilded Serpent on the night he disappeared, Leopold's connection to the establishment was less direct. According to his landlord, Aloysius Crane, Leopold had been working late on some accounts when he mentioned hearing what sounded like music coming from the direction of the saloon. This struck Crane as odd, since the Gilded Serpent was not known for musical entertainment. When Leopold failed to appear for breakfast the following morning, a search was organized. His body was never found, but searchers did discover his ledger books scattered along the trail between his boarding house and the saloon. The pages showed signs of being hastily torn from their bindings, and several bore what appeared to be mud stains, though it had not rained in over 2 weeks. More peculiar was the condition of Leopold's room, which Crane described as disturbed in a manner that suggested extreme agitation. Furniture had been moved, drawers had been pulled out, and their contents scattered, and the floor showed scuff marks consistent with someone pacing frantically for hours. When Sheriff Brooke questioned Cordelia about Leopold's disappearance, she maintained that she had not seen him that night. She acknowledged that there had been music in the establishment, explaining that one of her patrons had brought a harmonica and had been playing frontier ballads for the entertainment of the other customers. This explanation satisfied the sheriff, though several witnesses later claimed that they had seen no musician in the saloon that evening. Cornelius Vale, when pressed for details about the supposed harmonica player, became vague and evasive. He claimed the man had been a traveling merchant passing through on his way to California, but could provide no description of his appearance or recall his name. When asked to produce the harmonica, Vale stated that the stranger had taken it with him when he left. This explanation struck many as unsatisfactory, but in the absence of evidence suggesting foul play, the sheriff again concluded that Leopold had likely decided to abandon his prospects and continue west to the California gold fields. The pattern of disappearances continued throughout the summer and into the fall of 1850. By October, 7 men had vanished from the settlement, all of whom had been known to frequent the Gilded Serpent. While the territorial authorities continued to attribute these disappearances to the hazards of frontier life, the remaining residents began to whisper among themselves about the true nature of what was occurring at Cordelia Ashmore's establishment. The whispers reached a crescendo following the disappearance of Dr. Ambrose Whitfield on October 15, 1850. Unlike the previous victims, who had been miners and laborers of little social standing, Dr. Whitfield was a respected member of the community who had come to Nevada Territory specifically to document the flora and fauna of the region for the Smithsonian Institution. His disappearance could not be easily dismissed or ignored. Dr. Whitfield had spent the evening of October 14th at the Gilded Serpent, not as a patron seeking drink and companionship, but as a researcher interested in collecting folk tales and songs from the miners. Several witnesses confirmed that he had been taking notes throughout the evening and had questioned various customers about their experiences in the territory. According to Barnabas Wexford, who was present that night, Dr. Whitfield had shown particular interest in stories about the local Paiute population and their beliefs regarding the land on which the settlement had been built. What made Dr. Whitfield's disappearance particularly troubling was the discovery of his research notes the following morning. Rather than being scattered or torn like Leopold Vance's ledgers, the notes were found neatly arranged on the floor of the saloon's main room, held down by stones that appeared to have been deliberately placed. The handwriting in the final entries showed a marked deterioration from Dr. Whitfield's usual precise script, becoming increasingly erratic and difficult to read. The last legible entry in his notes, dated October 14th, 10:30 p.m., reads, "Have made disturbing discovery regarding foundation of this establishment. Conversation with local indigenous sources confirms suspicions about sacred burial grounds. Must investigate further." Strange acoustics in building suggest hollow spaces beneath floor. Proprietress shows signs of extreme nervousness when questioned about construction process. Employee Vale refuses to discuss history of land. Will attempt to examine foundation tomorrow. Below this entry, the handwriting becomes almost illegible, but several words can be made out. Voices beneath. Calling. No, here's. And what appears to be, should not have come here. The final line consists of a single word written repeatedly across the page in increasingly frantic script. Listening, 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 listening. When Dr. Whitfield's notes were presented to Sheriff Brooke, he initially dismissed them as the ravings of a man who had consumed too much alcohol. However, pressure from territorial authorities in Carson City, who were concerned about the disappearance of a Smithsonian researcher, forced him to conduct a more thorough investigation of the Gilded Serpent. On October 20th, 1850, Sheriff Brooke arrived at the saloon with a deputy and a territorial marshal named Jonas Blackwood, who had been dispatched from Carson City. Their stated purpose was to examine the building's foundation and question Cordelia about the circumstances surrounding Dr. Whitfield's disappearance. What they found would challenge their understanding of what had been occurring in the settlement. The investigation began in the main room of the saloon where Dr. Whitfield's notes had been discovered. Using hammers and chisels, the lawmen began testing the floorboards to determine if there were indeed hollow spaces beneath the building. Their efforts quickly confirmed Dr. Whitfield's suspicions. Large sections of the floor produced a distinctly hollow sound when struck, suggesting the presence of cavities or chambers below. When they attempted to question Cordelia about these findings, they discovered that she had vanished sometime during the night. Her personal belongings remained in her room above the saloon, but she was nowhere to be found. Cornelius Vale claimed that he had not seen her leave and professed ignorance about her whereabouts. When pressed about the hollow spaces beneath the floor, he became agitated and insisted that he knew nothing about the building's construction, despite having worked there for months. Marshal Blackwood ordered the removal of several floorboards in the area where Dr. Whitfield's notes had been found. What they uncovered defied easy explanation and would haunt the investigators for the remainder of their lives. Beneath the saloon's floor lay a complex network of excavated chambers and tunnels that extended far beyond the building's foundation. The earth had been carefully removed, and the walls of these underground spaces reinforced with timber, creating what amounted to a subterranean complex beneath the establishment. More disturbing than the existence of these chambers was their contents. The spaces contained what appeared to be makeshift living quarters, complete with bedding, personal belongings, and supplies of food and water. However, these were not conventional rooms, but rather what could only be described as cells. Heavy chains had been driven into the reinforcing timbers, and the walls showed clear evidence of attempts to claw or dig through the earth. The air in the chambers was foul with the stench of human waste and decay. In the largest of these underground rooms, the investigators made a discovery that would forever change their understanding of what Cordelia Ashmore had been doing at the Gilded Serpent. Arranged along one wall were the personal effects of all 7 men who had disappeared from the settlement. Tobias Grimm's distinctive silver watch, Leopold Vance's wire-rimmed spectacles, Dr. Whitfield's leather satchel, and items belonging to the other victims. Each collection of belongings had been carefully organized and labeled with the victim's name and the date of his disappearance. Adjacent to these personal effects, the investigators found what appeared to be Cordelia's own records of her activities. Written in her precise handwriting on pages torn from various books, these documents detailed not only the dates and circumstances of each disappearance, but also what could only be described as observations about the victim's behavior during their captivity. The clinical tone of these notes was perhaps more disturbing than their content, as they suggested a level of detachment and premeditation that transformed what might have been crimes of passion into something far more calculated and cold. One entry, dated June 20th, 1850, reads, "Subject T.G. has ceased attempts to escape after 8 days in confinement. Consumption of provided sustenance has returned to normal levels. Physical condition remains stable, though obvious weight loss has occurred. Subject continues to speak frequently to himself, though content of speech has shifted from pleas for release to what appears to be conversation with unseen entities. Will continue observation." Another entry, dated July 30th, describes Leopold Vance. Subject L.V. shows marked intellectual curiosity about his circumstances despite obvious distress. Has attempted to map the layout of the chambers by pacing and counting steps. Questions about the purpose of his confinement remain frequent, but have become more sophisticated, suggesting adaptation to the environment. Physical health declining, but cognitive function remains intact. The most chilling aspect of these records was their abrupt termination. Each victim's documentation would continue for several weeks, before ending with a terse final entry stating only subject expired, followed by a date. The implications of this clinical language were clear to the investigators, though the absence of any human remains in the chambers raised questions about what Cordelia had done with the bodies of her victims. Marshal Blackwood's official report, filed on October 25, 1850, describes the underground complex as an elaborate system of confinement designed for the purpose of holding human beings against their will. The report details the discovery of the personal effects and Cordelia's documentation, but stops short of explicitly stating what the investigators believed had occurred. This restraint was likely due to the unprecedented nature of the crimes and the complete absence of the perpetrator, who had vanished as thoroughly as her victims. The search for Cordelia Ashmore continued throughout the winter of 1850-1851, but no trace of her was ever found. Cornelius Vale, when subjected to prolonged questioning, finally admitted that he had been aware of the underground chambers and had helped Cordelia transport the unconscious victims from the saloon's main room to the cells below. According to his confession, Cordelia had been drugging selected customers with a substance she obtained from local Paiute traders, waiting for them to lose consciousness, and then moving them to the chambers through a concealed trapdoor behind the bar. Vale claimed that Cordelia had told him the men were claim jumpers who deserved to be punished, and that she intended to turn them over to territorial authorities once she had extracted confessions from them about their crimes. He maintained that he had believed this explanation until Dr. Whitfield's disappearance, when he began to suspect that Cordelia's true motives were far darker than she had admitted. His decision to remain silent, he claimed, was based on fear for his own safety and the hope that the situation would resolve itself without his intervention. Vale's confession led to his arrest and trial for conspiracy and accessory to kidnapping, though the absence of bodies made murder charges difficult to pursue. He was convicted and sentenced to 20 years hard labor, serving his time at a territorial prison in Carson City until his death from pneumonia in 1863. His final statement to authorities, given shortly before his death, contained a detail that would not be fully understood until years later. According to the prison chaplain who attended Vale in his final hours, the dying man became increasingly agitated and insisted on speaking about the events at the Gilded Serpent. He claimed that Cordelia had not acted alone and that there had been others involved in the disappearances, though he had never seen them directly. These collaborators, he maintained, came and went through tunnels that connected the chambers beneath the saloon to other locations in the territory. When pressed for more specific information, Vale could only say that he had occasionally heard voices in the underground complex that did not belong to Cordelia or any of the known victims. The Gilded Serpent Saloon was demolished in November 1850, and the underground chambers were filled with earth and stones. The territorial government declared the land unsuitable for development, and it remained vacant for several decades. However, the disappearance of 7 men and the mystery of what had become of their bodies continued to trouble local authorities. Various theories were proposed, ranging from disposal in abandoned mine shafts to cremation in the saloon's furnace, but no evidence was ever found to support any particular explanation. In 1853, 3 years after Cordelia's disappearance, a Paiute hunting party discovered what they claimed were human bones in a remote canyon approximately 12 miles from the former location of the Gilded Serpent. When territorial officials investigated the site, they found the remains of at least 6 individuals, all of whom appeared to be adult males who had died within the previous few years. The bones showed signs of having been deliberately buried and then later disturbed, possibly by scavengers or natural erosion. While these remains could not be definitively linked to the victims of the Gilded Serpent, several personal items found at the burial site suggested a connection. Among these were buttons consistent with those described on clothing worn by several of the missing men, as well as fragments of what appeared to be Leopold Vance's distinctive brass spectacle frames. However, the remote location of the burial site raised new questions about how the bodies had been transported there and who had been responsible for their interment. The Paiute hunters who discovered the remains reported that the burial site showed evidence of repeated visits over several years. Paths had been worn through the surrounding brush, and areas of disturbed earth suggested that additional burials might have taken place there. When questioned about the site's history, local Paiute elders claimed that their people had never used the canyon for burials and considered it to be cursed ground that should be avoided. As the 1850s progressed and Nevada Territory developed more sophisticated law enforcement and administrative systems, several attempts were made to reopen the investigation into the Gilded Serpent disappearances. In 1857, a territorial investigator named Marcus Thornfield was assigned to review the case files and determine whether sufficient evidence existed to pursue federal charges against any surviving conspirators. Thornfield's investigation, while more thorough than previous efforts, ultimately reached the same conclusions. Multiple men had been kidnapped and likely murdered, but the perpetrators had vanished, and the evidence was insufficient to pursue further prosecutions. Thornfield's report, completed in early 1858, did include several new details that had not been previously documented. Through interviews with surviving witnesses and examination of additional physical evidence, he determined that the underground complex beneath the Gilded Serpent had been under construction for several months before Zachariah Kestrel's death. This suggested that the kidnapping operation had been planned well in advance and that Zachariah himself might have been involved in its creation. More troubling was Thornfield's discovery that similar disappearances had occurred in other mining settlements across the territory during the same period. While these cases had been handled by local authorities and had not been connected to events at the Gilded Serpent, Thornfield's review revealed patterns that suggested a coordinated effort involving multiple locations and perpetrators. In total, he documented 23 unexplained disappearances of adult males from mining communities across Nevada Territory between 1849 and 1851. The possibility that Cordelia Ashmore had been part of a larger criminal organization led Thornfield to expand his investigation beyond Nevada Territory. Through correspondence with law enforcement agencies in California, Utah Territory, and Colorado Territory, he identified additional cases that shared similar characteristics. Lone men with modest financial resources disappearing from saloons or boarding houses, often after displaying behavior that witnesses described as agitated or fearful, and always leaving behind personal belongings that suggested their departures had been involuntary. Thornfield's final report, submitted to territorial authorities in March 1858, painted a disturbing picture of what appeared to be a systematic effort to target and eliminate vulnerable individuals across the western mining frontier. The report suggested that this operation had involved dozens of participants and had resulted in the deaths of potentially hundreds of victims over a period of several years. However, the evidence remained largely circumstantial, and the passage of time had made further investigation increasingly difficult. The case officially remained open but inactive until 1864, when Nevada achieved statehood and its law enforcement responsibilities were reorganized. At that time, many territorial-era case files were transferred to state archives, where they remained largely forgotten for several decades. The Gilded Serpent case might have remained buried in these archives indefinitely, if not for the research efforts of Dr. Matthias Crane, an archaeologist from the University of California who became interested in frontier-era crime patterns while researching his doctoral dissertation in the 1930s. Dr. Crane's interest in the case was initially academic, part of a broader study of social violence on the 19th century American frontier. However, As he delved deeper into the available documentation, he became convinced that the Gilded Serpent case represented something far more significant than an isolated criminal incident. His research, conducted primarily between 1934 and 1938, uncovered connections between the Nevada disappearances and similar events across the western United States that suggested the existence of what he termed an organized network of systematic predation. In 1939, Dr. Crane published a preliminary paper on his findings in the Journal of American Criminal History. The paper, titled Patterns of Organized Disappearance in Frontier Mining Communities, 1849-1855, presented evidence for what Crane believed was a coordinated criminal enterprise that had operated across multiple territories and states. According to his analysis, this network had been responsible for the disappearances of at least 200 individuals, primarily single men with modest resources who were unlikely to be missed by family or authorities. Crane's research suggested that the network had operated through a series of establishments similar to the Gilded Serpent, often saloons or boarding houses located in remote mining communities. These businesses served as both lures to attract potential victims and processing centers where the actual crimes were committed. The victims were typically drugged and confined in hidden chambers until they could be transported to more remote locations for final disposal. What made Crane's theory particularly compelling was his identification of common elements across all the suspected sites. Each establishment had been built on land with historical significance to local indigenous populations, often former burial grounds or sacred sites. Each had featured underground chambers or tunnels that were far more extensive than necessary for normal business operations, and each had been operated by individuals who had appeared in the community shortly before the disappearances began and who had vanished when authorities began investigating. In 1940, Dr. Crane received permission from Nevada state authorities to conduct archaeological excavations at the former site of the Gilded Serpent. His team's work, conducted over 3 months during the summer of that year, uncovered evidence that supported many of his theories while raising new and troubling questions about what had occurred there nearly a century earlier. The excavations revealed that the underground complex beneath the saloon had been far more extensive than the 1850 investigation had determined. In addition to the chambers that had been discovered by Marshall Blackwood and his team, Crane's archaeologists uncovered a network of tunnels that extended over 200 yards from the main building. These tunnels connected to several natural caves in the surrounding hills, creating a subterranean system that could have been used to move people and materials without being observed from the surface. More disturbing was the discovery of additional burial sites within the tunnel system itself. Crane's team found the remains of at least 12 individuals who appeared to have died during the same time period as the known Gilded Serpent victims. Unlike the bones found in the remote canyon in 1853, these remains showed clear evidence of violence, including fractures consistent with blunt force trauma and cut marks that suggested deliberate dismemberment. The condition and placement of these remains suggested that the underground complex had served not only as a prison, but as a site where victims were systematically killed and their bodies processed for disposal. Chemical analysis of soil samples from the excavation revealed traces of lime and other substances that would have been used to accelerate decomposition and control odors. This evidence painted a picture of an operation that was far more sophisticated and organized than had been previously understood. Perhaps most troubling was Crane's discovery of what appeared to be documentation related to the network's activities. Hidden in a sealed chamber deep within the tunnel system, his team found a collection of papers that included correspondence between various operators, financial records detailing payments and expenses, and what could only be described as operational manuals, providing instructions for site selection, victim acquisition, and body disposal. These documents revealed that the criminal network had been far more extensive and sophisticated than Crane had initially theorized. The papers indicated that operations had been conducted in at least 15 states and territories, with central coordination provided by a group that referred to itself as the Company. The network had apparently operated from the late 1840s through the mid-1850s, generating substantial profits through a combination of theft from victims and payments from undisclosed clients. The most chilling aspect of the documentation was its clinical approach to describing human beings. Victims were referred to as inventory or stock, their capture and processing described in terms more appropriate for cattle or mining equipment than human beings. Payment schedules were provided for different types of victims, with higher prices paid for individuals with specific characteristics or skills. The dehumanization inherent in these documents suggested that the network's operators had developed a systematic approach to mass murder that treated their victims as nothing more than commodities. Dr. Crane's excavation report, completed in 1941, provided the most comprehensive analysis of the Gilded Serpent case that had ever been undertaken. However, the outbreak of World War II and Crane's subsequent military service delayed publication of his final findings. When he returned to academic life in 1946, he found that much of his research material had been transferred to federal authorities and classified as part of an ongoing investigation into historical criminal organizations. The FBI's interest in Crane's research was reportedly related to concerns that similar networks might have evolved and continued operating into the 20th century. The systematic nature of the frontier-era crimes and the sophisticated organizational structure revealed by the recovered documents suggested that the perpetrators possessed skills and resources that could have been applied to more contemporary criminal enterprises. However, details of this federal investigation have never been made public, and most relevant documents remain classified. Dr. Crane continued his research into the Gilded Serpent case throughout the 1950s, though his focus shifted from archaeological investigation to analysis of the social and economic factors that had enabled such an extensive criminal network to operate undetected for several years. His work during this period concentrated on understanding how frontier conditions had created opportunities for organized crime and how similar vulnerabilities might exist in contemporary American society. In 1959, Crane published his final paper on the subject titled The Gilded Serpent Syndrome, Systematic Predation in Transition Societies. The paper analyzed the Gilded Serpent case within the broader context of social disruption and criminal opportunity, arguing that periods of rapid economic and demographic change created conditions that enabled sophisticated criminal organizations to exploit vulnerable populations. Crane's analysis suggested that the western frontier of the 1850s had provided ideal conditions for such organizations to develop and operate with minimal risk of detection or prosecution. The paper also included Crane's most detailed account of what he believed had happened to the victims of the Gilded Serpent and similar operations. Based on his analysis of the recovered documentation and archaeological evidence, he concluded that the network had operated what amounted to a systematic program of kidnapping and murder designed to eliminate individuals who were unlikely to be missed while generating profit through theft of their possessions and sale of their remains to undisclosed buyers. The identity and motivations of these buyers remained one of the most troubling aspects of Crane's research. The recovered documents included references to payments for specimens and materials, but provided no clear indication of who was purchasing human remains or for what purpose. Crane speculated that the buyers might have included medical schools in need of cadavers for anatomical study, though the frontier location of most operations made this explanation seem unlikely. Dr. Crane's research into the Gilded Serpent case officially ended with the publication of his 1959 paper, though he continued to receive occasional correspondence from individuals who claimed to have information about related cases or similar organizations. These communications were typically forwarded to federal authorities, and Crane maintained that he had no direct knowledge of any contemporary investigations or prosecutions resulting from his historical research. The site of the former Gilded Serpent remained undeveloped for several decades after Crane's excavation, serving occasionally as a destination for amateur historians and ghost hunters attracted by the location's notorious reputation. In 1964, the land was purchased by a mining company that planned to use it as a staging area for equipment and supplies. But the company abandoned the project after several months when workers reported equipment malfunctions and unexplained accidents that made the site impractical for commercial use. The workers' complaints focused on mechanical problems that seemed to occur with unusual frequency at the site. Generators would fail without apparent cause. Vehicles would develop engine troubles only when parked on the property, and electronic equipment would malfunction in ways that suggested electromagnetic interference. While these problems were likely attributable to natural geological conditions or residual contamination from the 19th century mining activities, they contributed to the site's reputation as cursed or haunted ground. In 1967, a group of university students from Reno attempted to conduct their own investigation of the Gilded Serpent site as part of a class project on Nevada frontier history. Their work was supervised by Dr. Harold Zimmerman, a professor of Western American history who had been familiar with Crane's research and believed that additional archaeological work might uncover new evidence about the case. However, the student project was abandoned after several weeks when team members began experiencing what they described as severe psychological distress while working at the site. According to Dr. Zimmerman's report to university administrators, multiple students complained of persistent feelings of anxiety and depression while on the property, as well as vivid nightmares and intrusive thoughts about violence and death. Several students reported hearing voices or sounds that others could not detect, and at least 2 experienced what appeared to be panic attacks while working in areas where the underground chambers had been located. While these symptoms might have been attributable to suggestion or the psychological impact of working at a site associated with mass murder, Dr. Zimmerman decided that the potential risks to student welfare outweighed the research benefits. The Zimmerman report, filed with the University of Nevada in late 1967, recommended that the Gilded Serpent site be declared off-limits to university research projects pending a comprehensive environmental and psychological assessment. This recommendation was accepted by university administrators, and the site was subsequently added to a list of locations considered unsuitable for student fieldwork. The report itself was archived in the university library's special collections, where it remained accessible to researchers but received little attention from subsequent scholars. The last known attempt to investigate the Gilded Serpent case occurred in 1969, when a freelance journalist named Patricia Morrison obtained permission from the current landowner to visit the site and interview surviving witnesses for an article she was writing about unsolved frontier crimes. Morrison's research had been inspired by the recent publication of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood and the growing popular interest in true crime narratives that combined journalistic investigation with literary techniques. Morrison spent 3 weeks in Nevada during the summer of 1969, conducting interviews and visiting locations associated with the case. Her work focused on documenting the lasting impact of the Gilded Serpent crimes on the local community and exploring how the case had influenced subsequent law enforcement practices in the region. She interviewed elderly residents who had lived in the area during the 1850s, as well as law enforcement officials and academics who had studied the case over the intervening decades. However, Morrison's article was never published. According to her editor at the magazine that had commissioned the piece, Morrison became increasingly disturbed and agitated during her research, and eventually requested that the assignment be canceled. She claimed that her interviews had revealed details about the case that were too disturbing to include in a magazine article, though she declined to elaborate on the nature of these discoveries. Morrison subsequently abandoned journalism and moved to a small town in Oregon, where she worked as a librarian until her death in 1994. The contents of Morrison's research files remained unknown until 2003, when they were donated to the Nevada Historical Society by her estate. The files contained extensive interview transcripts, photographs of the Gilded Serpent site, and handwritten notes that revealed Morrison had uncovered information about the case that had not been previously documented. However, access to these materials remains restricted pending legal review, and the Historical Society has declined to comment on their contents or significance. Today, the site of the former Gilded Serpent Saloon remains undeveloped. The land is currently owned by a Nevada corporation that uses it for equipment storage, though company representatives report that maintaining a presence at the location continues to present unusual challenges. Security cameras malfunction with unusual frequency, stored equipment shows signs of unexplained corrosion, and employee turnover at the facility is significantly higher than at the company's other locations. Local residents continue to avoid the area, particularly during the evening hours. The few individuals who have visited the site in recent years report experiencing feelings of unease and disorientation that they struggle to explain. Some describe hearing sounds that seem to come from beneath the ground, while others report seeing movement or shadows in their peripheral vision that disappear when they turn to look directly. The Gilded Serpent case remains officially unsolved, though few law enforcement agencies maintain active files on crimes that occurred over 150 years ago. The case is occasionally referenced in academic studies of frontier crime patterns or used as an example in criminology courses examining historical organized crime. However, the full scope of what occurred at Cordelia Ashmore's Saloon and the true extent of the criminal network with which she was associated may never be completely understood. Perhaps most troubling is the possibility that similar operations might have occurred at other locations during the same period, leaving behind their own legacy of unexplained disappearances and unmarked graves. The American frontier of the mid-19th century was vast and largely unpoliced, creating countless opportunities for systematic predation against vulnerable populations. How many other gilded serpents might have existed, and how many victims might have vanished into the underground chambers and hidden tunnels of seemingly respectable frontier establishments, remains a question that historians and criminologists continue to ponder. The case serves as a stark reminder that the romanticized vision of the American frontier often obscures darker realities about life in frontier communities. Behind the mythology of rugged individualism and frontier justice lay a harsher truth about the vulnerability of isolated individuals in lawless territories where predators could operate with virtual impunity. The 7 men who disappeared from the Gilded Serpent Saloon in the summer and fall of 1850 were seeking their fortunes in what they believed was a land of opportunity, but instead found themselves victims of a systematic program of exploitation and murder that reduced them to nothing more than inventory in a criminal ledger. And in the silence of the Nevada desert, where the Gilded Serpent once stood, the wind still carries whispers of those who vanished into the chambers beneath the earth, their voices joining the endless chorus of the forgotten dead who haunt the darker corners of American history.